The government of Assad in Syria has fallen. In just 12 days, rebels have toppled the dictator family that ruled the country for 50 years. At the center of this was the HTS rebel group and its leader, Ahmad al-Shara, also known by his fighter name, Abdul Muhammad al-Jalani. He is currently strengthening his grip over the new transitional government in Syria. But the interesting part about this is how the rebels took over the Assad regime. The HTS didn't just appear out of nowhere. For years, it has been strengthening itself in the Idlib province, safeguarded by none other than Turkey. And Turkey was more involved in the recent rebel offensive than many people realize. The Syrian National Army played a crucial role in the rebel offensive, fighting alongside the HTS. And this militia was created by Turkey. It's their chief backer to this day, providing weapons, funding, and coordination. Turkey itself is heavily involved in the Syrian civil war, as it holds Syrian territory in the north, and it has even performed multiple military operations inside of Syria. It is very likely that Turkey's President Erdogan knew about the recent revolt plans of the HTS, and even gave his permission for it. The reason for this involvement is that Turkey is playing a geopolitical chess game, mainly with Iran and Russia, but also with the US and Israel. Just like any other power, Turkey wants influence in the region, and it's willing to fight for it. In this video, we'll take a look at how Turkey has outplayed all of its rivals, and why it currently has the upper hand in Syria. But before we dive into the video, please hit that like button below to show your support for the channel. Making these videos costs a lot of time and effort, and it's only possible if you help us out in the algorithm. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Now, as you might have noticed, the Syrian civil war is really complex. There are not two sides fighting, but about a dozen or more. To understand how Turkey has gotten involved in this, we need to take a look back. The story really begins in the 2010s. During this time, Erdogan was already rising to power in Turkey, serving as the nation's prime minister. He toured the Middle East in 2010 and 2011, which was a sign of a changing foreign policy. Erdogan wanted to position Turkey as a leader in the Middle East, a radical shift from earlier foreign policy. Around the same time, there was turmoil in many Arab nations. There were political uprisings and mass demonstrations in countries like Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria, which later became known as the Arab Spring. Among the reasons for this were economic hardship and political repression. These events coincided with Erdogan's tours, and that wasn't by accident. Turkey saw this as an opportunity to get new allies and promote itself as the democratic alternative in the Middle East. That's why the tour was also dubbed the Arab Spring Tour. But in Syria, a country with 565 miles, or about 909 kilometers, of a border with Turkey, things went downhill. The dictator Assad was very afraid of the protests and began to use very harsh methods of repression. When security forces tortured and killed protesters, the Syrian population became very upset and started organized resistances. This started the Syrian Civil War in 2011, a war that has raged on for over a decade. Turkey was one of the first countries to actively support the opposition to Assad, as we'll get into later. But first, we need to understand the internal situation in Syria. Syria is a very divided country with a ton of differences. The former ruling family was Alawite, which was a sect of the Shia branch of Islam. The Alawites are a minority with their own culture and generally live in the west of Syria. The vast majority of the country are Sunnis, however, which is the biggest branch of Islam shared by most countries in the Middle East. Then you have the Kurds in the north of Syria, who follow the same religion but are ethnically separate from the Arabs. There's also a significant number of Assyrians in Syria who are mostly Christians. On top of this, there are many more small minorities. Because of these differences, there's not really a single resistance group in the civil war. The number of militias involved is in the hundreds, although they have formed loose alliances. You have moderate groups like the Free Syrian Army. They have broad support across many ethnicities. There are also Islamist groups, including the HTS. They have a strict interpretation of Islam, which doesn't sit well with Shia Muslims, moderate Sunnis, and other groups. In the north, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, including Kurdish separatists of the YPG. They want a separate Kurdish state, so their goal is very different from the other rebels. On top of all this, there are radical jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. They are even more extreme, as they don't only have strong religious views, but are also willing to use violence. Assad's front was more united, although he also had many militias fighting for him instead of his army. What makes this even more complicated is that foreign countries got involved, including Turkey. Initially, it wasn't that Turkey hates Assad. On the contrary, The two nations had relatively friendly relations before the war. In August of 2011, the government of Turkey even rejected a US demand for Assad to resign. But out of strategic reasons, the Turkish government wanted to appeal to the Sunni majority in Syria. It sees the unpopularity of his regime as an opportunity to get more influence. Also, the war crimes that Assad committed rapidly shifted public opinion in Turkey. So not long after the fighting broke out, Turkey hosted defectors from the Syrian army to train on its soil. These fighters later announced the start of the Free Syrian Army, one of the major opposition groups. Turkey went on to give them funding and supplies, including ammunition, arms, and tactical equipment. Turkey supported them with logistics coming from the northern border. The United States and the Gulf countries also joined their support of the Free Syrian Army, providing financial support and weapons. Turkey stayed the most consistent in its involvement, though, as the United States eventually withdrew many of its troops and the Gulf nations lost interest. But while Turkey was doing this, Iran and Russia chose to prop up the Assad regime. Putin and Khamenei have sympathy for their fellow dictator in Syria, and they have strategic ambitions in the region as well. Iran wanted to use Syria as a hub for its axis of resistance against Israel, and as an extension of its power in the Middle East. Putin has a special interest in the port of Tartus in Syria, where Russia has an important naval base since the Soviet times. It gives the Russian Navy crucial access to the Mediterranean, and it's one of the few Russian warm water ports that can't easily be blocked by NATO. Apart from giving weapons and a financial lifeline to Assad, Iran and Russia went even further. Iran set up Hezbollah bases in Syria, a group linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They began fighting side by side with the Assad regime. Russia helped the Assad regime by bombing opposition-held areas. This was often with no regard for civilian life, but it was as ruthless as it was effective. Russia was one of the main reasons why the Assad regime stood as long as it did, as it provided capabilities that Assad's army couldn't dream of. In 2017, Russia also decided to set up bases in Syria to start military operations there. We should also briefly mention the US involvement in the war. American operations in Syria are mostly part of the war on terrorism, as it targets terrorist organizations like ISIS. ISIS expended a lot in the war-torn nations of Syria and Iraq, and at its peak, the group held about a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. That was until an international coalition began to fight them, and basically everyone teamed up to destroy the caliphate. The Trump administration delivered the final blow to ISIS, and in 2019, the group lost its last territory. By that point, the US military had mostly left, although it still has troops near the oil fields in the east of Syria. But the US also has a lot of indirect involvement, and it's backed rebels under the umbrella of the Syrian Democratic Forces. You think that they would be on the side of Turkey as a NATO ally, but that's not the case. This SDF group includes a lot of Kurdish groups, including the Kurdish YPG militia, and Washington has got a lot of heat for this. Turkey believes the YPG is linked to the Kurdish terrorist organization of the PKK. The PKK has been active inside Turkey since the 1980s, and they pose a constant terror threat. This is because of a feud over eastern Turkey, where some Kurds want to start an independent Kurdish state. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the Middle East without a country, as they are spread across modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The fact that Turkey hates this US-backed rebel group has led to some awkward situations. Turkey has fought the YPG on multiple occasions. In these fights, Turkey tries not to hit the US forces that back the YPG, one of the rare occurrences where NATO allies indirectly fight each other. The first Turkish military operation inside Syria was Operation Euphrates Shield, from 2016 to 2017. A year later, in 2018, it invaded again with Operation Olive Branch, then again with Operation Peace Spring in 2019, and Operation Spring Shield in 2020, which we'll cover later because it has to do with the HTS. From 2022, Turkey has been bombing Kurdish targets. Just a few months ago, it destroyed 47 of them in retaliation for a terrorist attack on a Turkish defense company. With all of these campaigns, Turkey has two big objectives. It wanted to prevent a Kurdish autonomous region, and it wanted a buffer zone along the Syrian-Turkish border to protect its own land. This had mixed results, as Turkey couldn't capture territory all across the border. But in negotiations with the Americans and, after 2019, the Russians, Turkey got some kind of a buffer zone. In the west, there was an interesting section in this Turkish buffer zone. Near the Idlib province, Turkey didn't have direct control. Instead, it's an area controlled by Turkey's allies. We'll dive more into the specific region because it's where the recent rebellion came from. In the first years of the war, Idlib was an active fighting ground for the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army. However, they struggled to take over the province from Assad and Hezbollah forces. In 2015, jihadist and Islamist forces took advantage of the situation and managed to capture the city of Idlib. A year later, though, a jihadist group and an Islamist group turned on each other and began to fight. In 2017, a third militia joined the fight, and the province fully descended into chaos. That year, a city in the Idlib province also saw one of the worst chemical attacks in the war, in an attack by the Assad regime. Later, in 2017, the Islamist group led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took control over the Idlib city and most of the land along the Turkish border. He beat some tough competition, driving out other extremists. They renamed themselves from Jabhat al-Nusra to HTS, erasing their former al-Qaeda links. Afterwards, Turkey launched an incursion into the Idlib province, establishing a dozen observation outposts. Interestingly enough, they didn't really touch the HTS. The HTS was initially not supported by Turkey, though. In fact, Turkey supported rival militias that were actively fighting them. These rival militias included the Free Syrian Army, the National Front for Liberation, and the Ahrar al-Sham Islamist groups. But seeing their strong position in Idlib, Turkey started a pragmatic working relationship with the HTS. What really changed the situation was a 2019 offensive by Assad. His forces started a major offensive into this last rebel stronghold, trying to retake the region with Iranian and Russian support. This was an impending disaster for Erdogan. 1 million people were displaced in Idlib, and they could flee to Turkey, causing a humanitarian disaster. If the Syrian government took over the region, the next step would likely be to retake the Turkish-held buffer zones to the east of Idlib, as they would get access to a key highway. To prevent this, Turkey directly intervened in early 2020. The Turkish armed forces were already fighting Assad from their observation outposts, often fully encircled by the Syrian army. Several Turkish soldiers had died in the clashes, but Erdogan doubled down, sending even more soldiers and increasing the number of outposts to 35. On the 27th of February, Turkey started Operation Spring Shield, a direct incursion into the Idlib province. This was in response to a Syrian or Russian airstrike, killing 34 Turkish servicemen. In response, Turkey sent up 20,000 soldiers across the border and killed 165 of Assad's forces in a matter of days. Russia went on to start ceasefire talks because it didn't want a full-scale war between Turkey and Assad. In the 2020 Moscow Agreement, the countries agreed that Assad could keep some of his gains and that Turkish and Russian forces would secure a safe zone between the opposition forces and Assad. Basically, Turkey had saved the HTS from going under. And afterwards, Turkey chose to tolerate the group and calm down the situation in Idlib. This was because the HTS started a local government called the Syrian Salvation Government. Erdogan previously stated that he was willing to work with any government replacing Assad, apparently even if they have an Islamist background. Idlib was also one of the last rebel strongholds, and Turkey wanted to keep the seed of resistance alive. Now, before moving forward, I wanted to share with you that I'm tired of seeing ads everywhere I go. I mean, how many ads has YouTube shown on this video alone? That's why we've launched a newsletter a few years ago called Global Recaps. We have been sending daily news right to you with no ads. Yeah, that's right. We have sent 2,500 newsletters to date, but not one of them have contained an ad. So if you want global news with no ads and no censorship, then this is the solution for you. Sign up now by scanning the QR code on the screen or link in the description. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. Over the following years, Turkey's relationship with the Idlib province improved. Despite calls to remove the HTS from countries like Russia, Turkey didn't. The situation on the ground improved a lot, as the local government provided things like healthcare and education. The local economy improved, and Turkey can take credit for this. The Turkish lira was adopted as legal tender, providing more stability than its Syrian counterpart. The border with Turkey was opened up for trade, providing a crucial lifeline for the province. In return, the HTS tolerated Turkish-backed groups in the Idlib province, who united under the Syrian National Army. The HTS group opened up communication channels with the Turkish military, preventing any escalation in the region. It's unclear whether the HTS got any funding from Turkey, but Turkey at least helped them indirectly. The group gets a lot of money from taxes and tariffs in Idlib, and this local economy is supported by the trade coming from Turkey. This relatively stable situation continued for about 4 years. People weren't paying attention to Syria at all because all of the other global developments that were happening during that period. But Turkey and the HTS were secretly planning something. Seeing Russia distracted by the war in Ukraine and Iran suffering major blows in Lebanon because of the war in Israel, Assad's network of allies was significantly weakened. Russia needed its soldiers, fighter jets, and bombers at home. Iran's Hezbollah group lost a lot of soldiers and firepower, and its positions in Syria were also repeatedly bombed by Israel. So, the HTS and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army began to plan an uprising. They reportedly already wanted to start in October, but Erdogan dismissed it. When they asked again a month later, the Turkish government and military probably gave them the green light. So the HTS, supported by Turkey's Syrian National Army, went on with their rapid offensive on November 27th. It turned out to be a well-planned blitzkrieg, as they quickly went from the Idlib province to Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and eventually the capital, Damascus. It was the type of special military operation that would make Putin jealous. Assad's forces were overwhelmed, probably due to a lack of foreign support. Russia helped with a few bombing rounds on the rebels, but it was already too late. Assad was forced to flee, taking the first opportunity to go to Moscow, where he was granted asylum. This created an interesting situation, and an opportunity to put an end to the 13-year-long war. The HTS and its allies now occupy most of Syria, including virtually all population centers. However, the big question is, who will run the new government? Right now, there's a transitional government to manage the country's affairs. Ministers of the Syrian Salvation Government from Idlib, including the leader of the HTS movement, Mohammed al-Jalani, are at the center of this, joined by leaders from other rebel groups. The plan is to hold an election several months from now, once all the dust has settled and the conflict has cooled down enough. There will likely be a new phase of fighting between the HTS and Turkey on one side and the SDF on the other side. The transitional government will try to reunify Syria and take the SDF-held territory in the northeast. However, it's still not clear how this will go. It's very likely that the Syrian National Army and the HTS will be victorious. Then they will likely have a say over the new constitution, and they will have a big chance of winning a popular vote, as they're massively popular among the Syrian public right now. Currently, the streets in Syria are filled with massive crowds celebrating the fall of Assad and their new leader, Mohammed al-Jalani. If he and his allies get into power, this will mean a whole lot for foreign policy. Turkey has won the geopolitical game here, because the new government will be friendly to them. It has played a key role in supporting the opposition and giving the HTS a safe haven from 2019 onwards. For other countries, this is nightmare fuel, though. Iran could probably forget about having anything to do with Syria for the foreseeable future. Their support for Assad through funding and weapons sales won't be forgotten by Syrians, not to mention the Hezbollah paramilitary that was active in the war. The HTS especially won't forget them, as they've directly fought Iran's proxies. Iran is already crippled, and it's starting to lose its proxy war with Israel and Lebanon. Just before the insurgency in Syria started, Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire in Lebanon with terms favorable to Israel, which is a sign of weakness. With Syria gone, Hezbollah and Iran are fully in crisis mode. They used to get their weapons and supplies to Lebanon through Syria, but that won't work now. This means that the axis of resistance is shattered. Meanwhile, Shia Syrians are fleeing the country en masse to Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. They're afraid of persecution, because they're linked to the Assad regime and its Shia-majority ally, Iran. Mohammed al-Jalani has promised not to attack any minority, but you never know with a former ISIS and al-Qaeda member. So it's clear that Iran and its supporters aren't happy. The other big ally of Assad isn't doing much better. Russia is scrambling to get its military assets and Russian soldiers out of Syria, which it deployed there in 2017. Russian ships have abandoned their port in Syria, and there are doubts whether Russia will be able to keep its strategic naval base there. Putin sure hasn't made himself popular with the Syrian people, as he helped Assad with the infamous bombing campaigns killing thousands of civilians. Maybe Russia could start on a new page with the new government as it's trying desperately, but it seems unlikely. Russia too has fought the HTS before, killing many of its members. Turkey is the real winner in all of this, as it stands to gain a lot of influence in post-Assad Syria. In return for helping the opposition, Turkey could replace other foreign nations and establish a military presence in Syria. This is a big deal, considering how strategic Syria's position is. It would catapult Turkey in the power rankings, and make Turkey one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East, likely surpassing Iran. Also, there are political advantages for Turkey as well. The new Syrian government will probably align itself with Turkey's interests. This includes the issues of the Kurds in Syria and Turkey. The new government in Syria could work together with Turkey to destroy the Kurdish YPG and PKK. For Erdogan, that would make him massively popular at home, as it's one of his biggest reasons why he got involved in Syria in the first place. The US will probably face a lot of pressure from Turkey and the new Syrian government to abandon the YPG and the SDF. With Trump getting into office, the US will probably get out of Syria, as he has already said before. It's not just about fighting and geopolitics, though. The refugee problem in Turkey is bigger than you think, and it's one of the biggest reasons why Turkey wants a new government in Syria. Right now, Turkey hosts 3.6 million Syrian refugees, and the situation has been going on for 13 years. For a country of 85 million people, that's a heavy burden, especially considering that Turkey isn't that rich. In Turkish politics, Erdogan has been getting a lot of heat for this, as some people in the opposition want him to deport these refugees. He partially listened to them in 2023, when he deported about 500,000 Syrian refugees to the Turkish safe zones and the rebel-held Idlib province. Erdogan was criticized for this by humanitarian organizations, but now that political issue seems to be resolved. The new government will welcome these refugees, and these millions of refugees will likely be returned. It's only uphill from there, because Turkey will probably help in the rebuilding of Syria too. Syria has lost more than $100 billion in infrastructure during the war, and the total economic cost is estimated to be $1.2 trillion. But Syria has a lot of economic potential. Before the war, it had a GDP of nearly $70 billion, which has gone down to just $9 billion right now. With Turkey's help, it can get back on its feet. As a neighboring country, Turkey is able to easily invest in the Syrian economy and trade with it. Also, Turkey will likely only profit from its reconstruction phase. Stocks of Turkish construction companies have been rallying since the fall of the Assad regime, and that's because they are about to get a ton of orders. And all of the money that's invested into Syria right now will pay off massively, as Syria's GDP has the potential to increase 10 or even 20-fold. All in all, the fall of Assad is pretty exciting stuff for Turkey. Because it helped the rebels, it will have a strong position in Syria for years to come, unlike its rivals, Russia or Iran. It could have been a move of geopolitical genius on Turkey's end, but they definitely had luck on their side. Thanks for watching. If you want to keep updated on our videos, please hit the subscribe button down below.